International trade is a fascinating subject, not only to students of economics and management, but also to people who want to understand how trade takes place between nations and what might be the underlying forces that determine this relationship between countries. In this particular presentation, which is on international trade, the first one, I shall be presenting to you a brief history of world trade just to locate the subject and see how this trade has progressed in history. We talk about early trade. What happened during this early period? There was trade taking place, and trade has taken place over centuries. What did they trade with each other and why did they trade? It is quite obvious they traded because they had certain things that they could offer and they wanted to collect things that they did not have. So, probably individual travelers have gone across regions and have offered what they could and collected what they did not have. In course of time, these individuals not only collected items for themselves, but they also collected items for others and thus became traders. These traders, what did they trade in? They traded in salt, in gold, in textiles, in spices, is what we read in history. We also find that they shared knowledge, they shared ideas, and they shared practices from those places where they traveled and brought back those ideas back home. This trading between regions was supported by the domestication of animals, especially the horses, the camels, the elephants, the mules. These animals could carry loads and could travel long distances. Today, we know that the international trade has come a long way from just land routes to maritime routes to international air routes. And all these routes, that changes that we have done, they become the ports of the country or the exports. That is the ports from where the border lines from where the goods are sent out of the country, and these are also the borders from which goods are brought into the country. So these three main ways of trading, physical trading of goods and services are happening, but also with internet technology, a lot of trade also takes place through the internet. Now, it's here to study what doctrines or what philosophies have guided the trade in the world. And the first one that we study as student of economics is the doctrine of mercantilism. Mercantilists was an economist, was a group of economists who believed in um, trading with other countries with an intent to uh, import as much gold as possible instead of importing goods. So, this mercantilist philosophy was in Western Europe and it was during the 16th to 18th century. Many countries of the world was influenced by this idea, and countries would want to import gold and silver as much as possible because that is what made a country rich. And they discouraged imports of goods because when goods came into the country, they would have to export gold to pay for whatever the imports are. So they had a very a policy where they had restrictive way of looking at trade, and they believed that only collecting gold and silver through trade by exporting goods and collecting gold and silver was the way to for a country to become rich. This philosophy gathered momentum, and finally, we find that the English Navigation Act itself was passed based on this idea, and it was passed in 1651 until about 1849. It regulated international trade. The question is, how long did this kind of trade policy continue? Did it get replaced by some other policy, Was there a need for looking at trade differently, and what made that trade go differently? To understand this, we have another school of thought who are the Physiocrats. Now, Physiocrats were a group of French thinkers, and they were in the middle of the 18th century. These Physiocrats, they were in some sense furthering the idea of liberalism, and Adam Smith was very much influenced by the liberal thought of the Physiocrats. So Adam Smith wrote his famous book in 1776, briefly known as The Wealth of Nation. You may want to visit an earlier video which is exclusively on the ideas of Adam Smith. So Adam Smith propagated the idea that countries should encourage free trade, and he believed in the idea that countries, when they expand trade, countries can become rich. So this freeing trade from the barriers of restriction was something that Adam Smith encouraged, propagated, and many countries were influenced by the ideas of Smith. And also, there was a growing opposition to the barriers that were often prohibitive kind of customs duties that was imposed on goods coming into the country. So, this churning that took place in international trade resulted in another important act known as the Anglo French Treaty of 1786, which aimed at reducing tariffs. Now, after understanding these two schools of thought, it is here which is important to understand which of these thoughts continued, which of these survived, or did it change alternatively? What happened to these two philosophies of trade? And these two philosophies, if you understand, on one hand, the mercantilists who wanted restrictions on trade, and the physiocrats and Smith who wanted freedom in trade, if you understand the basics of these two theories, you will understand a long way how countries across the world are actually trading with each other, and which kind of policy influences the world has influenced the world at which time in history. So Smith's ideas were accepted across the world, but we also see that there was a resurgence of protectionism. Countries began to, though Smith was well accepted, not all nations were willing to go for free trade. Some nations still believed in this kind of protectionism. So this idea of protectionism was not completely dead, and there were countries which were nursing this idea of protectionism. So by the middle centuries, again, countries started imposing bans on import of goods into the country. Fewer countries were doing that. Many countries were also working in such a way that they could protect their domestic firms from external competition. And we also find that Germany, for example, followed protectionism. And when we find later that many of these countries started sheltering their national economies, and we find that a Mercantilist Tariff Act was passed in 1890 in the US. But UK, for reasons, they stayed on with the free trade that Smith had propagated. But of course, the resurgence of protectionism was much milder. The methods that were used and the quantity of restriction that was placed on the goods that were being imported was much milder than the first wave of restrictionism that was followed under the mercantilist thought. So mercantilist has now come back to the scene, and by this time the World War had erupted. With the World War, most countries did very badly, and their economics was really difficult for them to recover. And this World War One gave them the idea that probably protecting the country from international competition would help the country to recover from the economic slowdown that countries had faced. This went on, and many countries opted for trade restrictions. We follow the second part, which is the Great Depression of the 1930s. And this 1930s strengthened this idea of protectionism, believing that when countries can restrict trade, countries would be able to recover their economics. In fact, the competitive devaluation that happened during this particular period is also attributed to the kind of relationships that were built between the nations. So exchange controls came in view. Countries were not willing to trade with each other as expected, and each country did retaliate to the other country. So it was not possible for a country to impose restrictions and control their foreign exchanges without the other country retaliating. So countries retaliated with each other, and this led to a complete breakdown of this kind of interdependence among nations. So these mercantilist policies continued to rule the world for after the Second World War. Now, when this world was going through this kind of a change, how could the idea of free trade has had benefits? So the question was, how can countries get out of this mercantilist idea and move towards a freer trade, because freer trade had some advantages to the nations. It is here that we find another major change that took place in the world. Individual countries were not capable of bringing about this change in the world. So all that was not possible, and we find that the League of Nations happened in 1927, and countries of the world started continuously, some countries of the world started continuously raising the issue of protectionism. So this raising customs duties and protectionist practices made this group of countries, the 29 countries, come together to discuss how to avoid this kind of protectionist policies and high tariffs that were placed on goods that were being imported. It is here that countries got together, 29 countries got together, and they detailed in they decided in detail how countries can free the trade amongst themselves. So this led to, in some sense, some kind of a multilateral arrangement among nations. So the participating countries decided that among them they could have freer trade. At least, if not all countries of the world were willing to participate, some countries wanted to try out to be practicing free trade. So this is also considered as a precursor for the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that was constituted in 1947. It so happened that after that, some countries wanted to have much freer trade among themselves, and that is how another kind of an change took place, and this was the free trade arrangements. So countries in particular region, they joined together and they made trade freer among those participating nations. So we have these countries who formed regional arrangements of freeing trade, and we also find countries like they negotiated their agreements and they came to what was to liberalize the trade among these countries. So we have the NAFTA, then we have the South Asian Free Trade Area. These came in later, but the countries, the European Union, for example, so these countries came in, and their motive was how to free trade, at least in the geographical region that the countries were located, if not with the entire countries of the world. So today, much after this, what has happened is there are regional blocs, we call them, but also countries now began to believe that freer trade was doing good to nations. However, they needed to have more control over trade. With control and negotiation, they agreed to practice the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, for many, many years. And finally, this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was replaced by an international body which was called the World Trade Organization. Today, World Trade Organization is a multilateral body, and 164 member countries participate in the activities of trade in a much freer way than it was ever held before. However, there are also questions raised on how these trade has been practiced among different nations, but that I shall present to you sometime later on a session on WTO and its provisions. Now, today, if you look at international trade, what is the situation? All countries are, those countries are nation states, and they are all related to each other very intimately. No country can really escape the web of international trade. So we know that all countries have become a part of that web. We also know that some countries um, are driven by forces within their economies which prevented them from becoming freer. So, less developed countries were those who tried not to become so free in international trade. Now, what has really driven this international trade to expand to this level? We find that, um, of course, transport and communication has been an important reason, but the economic reasons can be attributed to the increased returns to the scale of production. So once the scale of production increased, then countries found that they need not sell all the goods at home alone. Even if they could rather exchange it with other countries and buy things from outside. So countries began to specialize in certain kinds of goods and services, and countries began to experience the benefits of economic benefits of trading with each other. They also found that products could be differentiated, and they could have the advantage of increasing the consumer welfare of their own citizens. So technical progress also has taken place because of international trade, and today knowledge and technology travels across the globe, and we have what is also known as the knowledge economy, where the world is using knowledge as a source of income, as a source of employment, as a source of trade. Now, at this point, I'm sure you would ask me, what was the story and why did we listen to the story? Now, international economics, if we see the kind of theories and laws that we study in international economics, have all emerged during different phases of international trade's history. The mercantilist period has helped develop the idea of tariffs and quotas. Quotas were in prevalence till the WTO banned it. So we have the mercantilist school giving the idea of protectionism or restrictionism. And as a student of economics, we study one whole subject on protectionism and the tools that were used to protect a country. So the tools were the tariffs, quotas, and the non-tariff quotas, non-financial methods of controlling the trade between nations. So the exposition of ideas on trade and tariffs come from the idea of mercantilists. Then the effects of tariffs and quotas, if we wanted to study, we can see it from the free trade. When these were removed, what happened to countries? Did they enjoy the benefit? Or what happened to production? What happened to consumers' surplus and producers' surplus? These ideas also concurrently developed with free trade. So two schools of thought can be understood to relate these kind of terms that have come up. Then we also understand that regional blocks came in, and with regional blocks, we have the other subject of customs union. So, customs union as a subject can be directly traced to this regional agreement that was made between the nations. Now, we also find the larger purpose of understanding GATT, WTO under the period when the multilateral arrangements was happening. We also find that exchange controls that were imposed by some countries during the World War led to the subject of exchange, foreign exchange itself, the study of foreign exchange, the theories of foreign exchange. So we will now realize that this little history that I shared gives you an idea which kind of theories might have developed at which period in history, and each period, when these periods were evolving, they also helped evolve ideas in the study of economics. So abstraction is the nature of economics, but this abstraction has happened with the evolution of trade over time, as have not one nation, as multiple nations of the world have interacted with each other. We find that now we can see so many less developed countries also decided not to practice free trade. India was one among them. At that time, it was relevant because those countries were less developed and they could not have competed with the developed countries of the world. So countries started looking inwards, protecting themselves from international trade. And how did they escape that period? And how did they um, go away? How did they open up later? When did the country feel that they wanted to open up to international trade, and what have been the benefits of international trade? So each of these theories are relevant in certain periods of history, and therefore it will do good to understand that these periods or evolutionary periods in history are important to study before we contextualize the economic theories. And today, in this era of globalization, if we want to make informed opinion about the trading relationship among nations, it is definitely important that we understand how did this subject grow, what theories have been done, how do we explain the many things that have happened among nations. So it is necessary to study international economics of time. So kindly share this video with your friends and subscribe to the channel. That will help me to make more videos for you on international economics and other subjects. Thank you.